despise them." Han Yi-won said it with a chilling indifference, as if he were discussing the weather rather than human beings. The Korean Mafia Boss sat in the dim, golden light of his private estate, a bold tattoo snaking up his neck and disappearing into his tailored collar. He was a man of cold efficiency, a king in a world of polished marble and violent traditions, a world where he believed his blood was the only thing that mattered. To Yi-won, his prejudice wasn't hate, it was his identity. Until the doors of the gala swung open and Amara Sinclair walked in. She was a vision in a soft pink dress, a color so delicate it seemed to mock the darkness of the men surrounding her. Her deep brown skin glowed against the silk, and her hair was tucked neatly behind her shoulders, giving her an air of untouchable poise. Yi-won's breath hitched. The white tiger of Seoul, a man who prided himself on never losing control, felt the world tilt on its axis. He approached her, expecting her to buckle under his status and the sheer weight of his wealth. But Amara didn't bow. She looked at him with a knowing, subtle expression of contempt, a look that said she knew exactly what kind of monster he was. When he tried to speak, she cut him down with a single, calm sentence. "I don't associate with men who mistake their ignorance for tradition." Yi-won was stunned. For the first time in his life, he was obsessed with someone who looked at his power and felt nothing but pity. But what Yi-won didn't know, what he couldn't possibly remember, was that 8 years ago, he had sat in a boardroom and laughed at a visionary entrepreneur's dreams. He had rejected the man's life's work with a racial slur and a flick of his wrist. He had destroyed that man's world without a second thought. That man was Amara's father, and his death was the price of Yi-won's tradition. Before we dive into this tale of revenge and redemption, comment below. Where are you watching from, and do you believe a man like Yi-won deserves a second chance? The gala was a sea of bowing heads and forced smiles, a predictable landscape Han Yi-won had navigated since he was old enough to hold a blade. As he adjusted his silk tie, his hand brushed the dark ink of the dragon tattoo on his neck, a permanent reminder of the heritage he guarded with cold, calculated cruelty. His associates stood in a rigid semicircle behind him, their shadows lengthening across the polished marble. Yi-won had just finished a dismissive remark about outside influences to a cluster of investors, his voice carrying that familiar edge of casual disdain that usually silenced a room. Then the air changed. Amara Sinclair didn't just walk into the room, she reclaimed it. The soft pink of her dress was a quiet rebellion against the aggressive blacks and golds of the mafia-dominated space. It draped over her deep brown skin like a second, more elegant armor. Yi-won felt a strange, tightening sensation in his chest, a physiological glitch he couldn't name. He expected her to notice him, to feel the magnetic pull of his power, or at the very least, to be intimidated by the heavy silence that followed his last remark. Instead, she simply looked at him. Her eyes were dark, steady, and terrifyingly clear. There was no flicker of fear, no flash of the exotic curiosity he was used to seeing in others. She didn't look at his tailored suit or the jade rings that signaled his rank. She looked directly into his eyes, and in that split second, Yi-won felt stripped bare. It wasn't a look of anger, it was a look of profound, quiet mockery. It was the way a scholar might look at a child throwing a tantrum, or a queen might look at a peasant masquerading in stolen robes. Yi-won straightened his posture, his jaw tightening. He was the white tiger. He owned the streets they stood on. But as Amara tilted her head ever so slightly, a ghost of a smirk playing on her lips, he felt a sudden, sickening wave of insignificance. She wasn't impressed. Worse, she was bored by him. She turned away to greet a colleague, the silk of her pink dress whispering against the floor, leaving Yi-won standing in a vacuum of his own making. The tradition he had boasted about only moments ago suddenly felt like a heavy, rusted chain. For the first time in 32 years, the most powerful man in the room felt utterly, devastatingly small. He reached for his champagne glass, his fingers trembling almost imperceptibly, his gaze anchored to the back of the woman who had just conquered his empire without saying a single word. In the week that followed, the white tiger became a ghost within his own empire. Han Yi-won sat at the head of the mahogany conference table, his gaze fixed on the rain streaking against the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Seoul headquarters, rather than the quarterly projections being presented. For the first time in his life, the numbers didn't speak to him. The only thing he could see, imprinted on the back of his eyelids like a solar flare, was the specific, soft shade of pink Amara Sinclair had worn, a color that now seemed to mock the sterile gray and black of his world. His obsession manifested as a frantic, internal puzzle. He spent his nights in the back of his darkened Maybach, scrolling through her digital footprint, trying to reconcile the outsider his father had warned him about with the woman whose intellect and poise had made him feel invisible. He was a man who prided himself on knowing every move before it was made, yet he couldn't predict why his heart hammered against his ribs at the mere thought of her contemptuous smile. The cracks in his legendary focus began to show. During a high-stakes negotiation with a shipping magnate from Busan, Jae-Won committed a cardinal sin of the underworld. He hesitated. When the magnate pushed for a larger percentage of the harbor routes, Jae-Won, usually a predator who would have crushed such insolence instantly, simply nodded, his mind drifting to the way Amara's voice had sounded when she dismissed him. His advisors exchanged panicked glances. By the time the meeting ended, Jae-Won had signed off on a deal that cost his family millions in potential revenue. "Sir, the margins," his youngest lieutenant ventured, his voice trembling. Jae-Won didn't even look at the contract. He was thinking about her skin, the deep, rich brown that had glowed under the gala's chandeliers, and how his own jade rings, symbols of a purity he had been taught to worship, suddenly looked dull and meaningless. He began to frequent the places she might be, lingering in upscale galleries and law district cafes, a predator turned into a desperate scavenger. He was a man who had everything, yet he was losing his mind over a woman who wanted nothing from him. His empire was built on the foundation of his iron will. But that will was being eroded by a single question that kept him awake until dawn. How could someone he had been raised to despise be the only person who made him feel truly alive? The more he tried to solve the mystery of Amara Sinclair, the more he realized he was actually losing the war against himself. The obsession that consumed Jae-Won's present eventually forced him to confront the ghosts of his past. One restless night, he found himself in the archives of his father's old estate, his fingers trembling as he pulled a dusty, leather-bound folder from the year he had first taken the mantle of the White Tiger. As he opened it, the scent of old paper and expensive tobacco filled the air, and suddenly, the sterile luxury of his office dissolved into a memory from 7 years ago. He was younger then, his neck tattoo still fresh and dark, his heart hardened by a father who taught him that mercy was a defect and purity was a weapon. He sat in a high-backed chair, looking down at a man named Marcus Sinclair. Marcus didn't look like a victim. He looked like a pioneer. He was a man with brilliant eyes and a portfolio of logistics innovations that could have revolutionized the Jae-Won Empire's shipping routes. Marcus had spoken with passion, his voice filled with the hope of a man who believed that excellence was the only currency that mattered. He talked about legacy, about building something that his daughter, a young law student at the time, could be proud of. He had extended a hand, offering a partnership that would have benefited both their houses. But Jae-Won hadn't even looked at the blueprints. He had let the silence stretch until it became an insult. He remembered the way he had leaned forward, his jade rings clicking against the table, his face a mask of casual cruelty. He hadn't seen a businessman. He had only seen the color of the man's skin and the threat of an outsider entering his sacred circle. The shadow of the past had barely begun to settle in Jae-Won's mind before the reality of the present struck with a different kind of violence. Amara Sinclair was not just a memory to be puzzled over. She was a woman under fire. Within 48 hours of his realization, the whispers began to circulate through the city's legal and criminal veins. A rival syndicate, the Oseong clan, vultures who had long waited for a crack in Jae-Won's focus, had found a new way to bleed him. They didn't strike at his warehouses or his docks. They struck at the woman who had brought the White Tiger to his knees. Evidence began to surface, linking Amara's prestigious law firm to a massive money laundering scheme involving offshore accounts she had never touched. It was a surgical strike, designed to strip her of her license, her reputation, and the very legacy she had built to honor her father. Jae-Won watched from the monitors in his high-rise office as the news broke, his jaw set in a hard, grim line. He saw the flashbulbs of the paparazzi surrounding her apartment, their questions stinging like hornets, and he saw the way she held her head, still high, still poised, but with a flicker of exhaustion in her eyes that he felt in his own gut. His advisors urged him to stay away. "It's a trap, sir," his lead counsel warned. "The Oseong are baiting you. If you intervene, you're admitting she's your weakness. You'll be handing them the keys to the city." Jae-Won didn't hear them. He was looking at a photograph of Amara leaving the courthouse, her pink dress from the gala replaced by a sharp, professional black suit, her face a mask of weary determination. He knew this was his opening. It was the only way a man like him, a man who had been rejected and pitied, could ever hope to stand in her presence again. He would be the shadow that fought the shadows. He didn't want to buy her affection, and he knew he couldn't charm his way past her contempt. But he could provide the one thing a brilliant lawyer framed by the mafia needed, a monster who knew exactly how the other monsters played. For the first time, Jae-Won didn't care about the harbor routes or the millions at stake. He saw the dismantling of her life as his own final chance at a different kind of power. If he could save the daughter of the man he had once destroyed, perhaps he could finally stop the bleeding of his own soul. He grabbed his coat, the dragon on his neck pulsing with a renewed, lethal purpose. "Prepare the cars," he commanded, his voice a low growl. "We're going to war for her." The clock on the wall of Jae-Won's penthouse chimed 2 a.m., the sound echoing through the cavernous, minimalist space like a funeral knell. He had been standing by the window for hours, watching the city lights of Seoul flicker like dying embers. He knew she would come. In the world of the elite, when the law fails and the public turns, there is only one place left to go, into the shadows. When the heavy oak doors finally opened, she didn't stride in with the same untouchable confidence she had displayed at the gala. Amara looked smaller, her silhouette framed by the harsh hallway lights. The pink dress was gone, replaced by a simple trench coat with the collar turned up against the rain, but her deep brown skin seemed to have lost its luster under the weight of the week's scandals. Her eyes, usually so sharp and mocking, were bloodshot and weary. She stopped several feet away from him, her hands buried deep in her pockets to hide their trembling. The silence between them was thick, heavy with the memory of the slurs he had once hurled at her father and the disdain she had shown him in return. "The Oseong clan has frozen my accounts," she said, her voice a raspy whisper that cut through the silence. "My firm has placed me on administrative leave. The police are waiting for a warrant." She took a shaky breath, her gaze finally meeting his. "You told the room you despised people like me. You told the world I was beneath you." Jae-Won didn't move. He watched a single bead of rainwater trail down her cheek, looking painfully like a tear. His heart, usually a cold stone of calculation, thrashed against his ribs. He saw the cracks in her armor, the raw, human vulnerability of a woman who had fought every battle on her own and had finally run out of weapons. "And yet," she continued, her voice gaining a bitter edge, "you are the only one with enough blood on your hands to stop them. I am not here because I want to be Han Jae-Won. I am here because I have nowhere else to go." Jae-Won finally stepped out of the shadows, the light catching the jade rings on his fingers. He saw the flicker of revulsion in her eyes as he approached, but he also saw something else, a desperate, flickering hope. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from her shoulder before he pulled it back, remembering his place. "I know why you're here, Amara," he said, his voice low and devoid of its usual arrogance. "You think you're asking a monster for a favor. But you're actually giving that monster the only thing he ever truly wanted, a reason to be useful to you." He didn't mention her father, not yet. He simply signaled to his guards to close the doors, locking the world out. For the first time, they were on the same side of the line, even if the line was drawn in blood. The golden glow of the desk lamps cast long, soft shadows across the office, stripping away the harsh edges of the room's usual authority. For the first time, Jae-Won wasn't sitting behind his desk as a judge. He sat opposite Amara, a glass of untouched whiskey between them. The silence was no longer a weapon of intimidation, but a bridge. As the rain continued to lash against the glass, Amara began to speak, her voice low and steady, unspooling a life he had never bothered to imagine. She spoke of a childhood filled with the scent of her father's blueprints and the sound of his laughter. She described Amara Sinclair not as the outsider Jae-Won had dismissed, but as a man who saw the world in patterns of efficiency and grace. A man who believed that if he worked twice as hard, the world would eventually forget to look at the color of his skin. She told him about the night her father came home 7 years ago, his spirit not just dampened, but extinguished. He hadn't told her the specifics of the meeting with the white tiger, only that the world was smaller and crueler than he had hoped. "He died believing he had failed me," Amara whispered, her gaze fixed on the warm light reflecting in her glass. "He spent his last months wondering what was wrong with him, never realizing the only thing wrong was the heart of the man sitting across from him." As she spoke, the traditions Jae-Won had worn like armor began to feel like a shroud. He looked at his jade rings, the symbols of a lineage he had thought was based on honor, and saw only the stains of unearned arrogance. He realized that his father's teachings hadn't been about protecting their culture. They had been about the cowardice of excluding anything they couldn't control. The purity he had bragged about was actually a hollow isolation. The weight of her words pressed against his chest until it was difficult to breathe. He saw the struggle she had endured to become a lawyer in a world that already had its mind made up about her, a struggle he had personally intensified by crushing her father's legacy. Under the warm lights of the office, the terrifying truth finally took root. He hadn't been protecting a kingdom. He had been a warden in a prison of his own making. Amara wasn't just a woman he desired. She was the living evidence of every soul he had stepped on to feel tall. For the first time, the white tiger didn't want to hunt. He wanted to atone. He watched her, the flickering lamplight dancing on her deep brown skin, and realized that the tradition he had lived by wasn't strength, it was the ultimate weakness. The mobilization began at midnight, but it was not a war for territory. It was a war for the truth. Han Jae-Won stood in the center of his war room, the flickering blue light of a dozen monitors illuminating the tension in his face. His senior associates, men who had served his father for decades, stood in a tight, judgmental semicircle. They watched with growing hostility as Jae-Won bypassed their traditional targets to focus entirely on the digital and legal web. The Oseong clan had spun around Amara Sinclair. "You are burning through decades of political capital for an outsider," his oldest advisor hissed, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and fury. "The Oseong are laughing. They see the white tiger playing bodyguard to a woman who isn't even one of us. This is not our way. This is not our tradition." Jae-Won didn't look up from the decryption codes. "Then the tradition is dead," he said, his voice a low, lethal vibration that silenced the room. "We have called ourselves kings, but we were just cowards hiding behind walls of our own making. I am not protecting an outsider. I am protecting the only person in this city with more honor than anyone in this room." He gave the order, and the white tiger's vast resources moved with surgical precision. While his hackers dismantled the forged bank records and traced the offshore accounts back to the Oseong leadership, his street teams moved into the legal district, not with guns, but with the cold, hard evidence required to force a retraction from the DA's office. Throughout the night, Jae-Won personally oversaw the operation, refusing to delegate the most sensitive tasks. He sat with Amara in the glass-walled office, his hands moving across the keyboard while she reviewed the legal affidavits. When his phone rang with threats from rival bosses, he answered them with a chilling finality, making it clear that any strike against Amara Sinclair was now a strike against the heart of the Jae-Won empire. As the sun began to bleed over the Seoul skyline, the first retractions hit the news cycles. The framed lawyer narrative was being dismantled piece by piece. His associates watched in stunned silence as Jae-Won, the man they thought was defined by his prejudice, used his entire legacy to restore a black woman's name. He had revealed his heart to a world that thrived on coldness, and in doing so, he had become more dangerous than ever. He wasn't just a boss anymore. He was a man with a purpose, and for the first time, his neck tattoo didn't feel like a mark of a gang, but the crest of a protector. He looked at Amara, whose weary eyes were finally beginning to clear, and he knew that the war within himself was finally being won. The victory over the Oseong clan felt like a sunrise after a lifetime of storms, but the peace in the office was fragile. While Jae-Won stepped onto the balcony to handle a final, urgent call with the district attorney, Amara remained among the scattered stacks of files and glowing monitors. For the first time in days, the adrenaline had faded, replaced by a quiet, investigative instinct. Her eyes drifted to a heavy, antique safe that stood slightly ajar, a rare oversight by a man who was usually perfect in his paranoia. Driven by a curiosity she couldn't suppress, she pulled the heavy door further open. Inside sat a single, leather-bound ledger labeled Restricted, Internal Business Proposals. She began to flip through the pages, her heart stuttering as she saw the cold, clinical way Jae-Won had documented the lives he had dismantled. Then she saw it, a familiar logo, a name that made the blood drain from her face. Amara Sinclair, Project, Global Logistics Integration. Attached to the proposal was a photograph of her father, younger and full of hope, pinned to a rejection memo. Amara's breath hitched. She remembered this day. She remembered her father coming home with a look of such profound worthlessness that it had never truly left him. Her eyes raced down to the bottom of the page, to the section marked Reason for Rejection. In Jae-Won's own sharp, elegant handwriting, the words were scrawled like a death sentence. Do not trust this type, incompatible with our blood, tradition over progress. The room seemed to tilt. The warm, golden light she had found comfort in moments ago now felt like the heat of an oven. She realized that the man who had spent the last 48 hours saving her was the same man who had pulled the trigger on her father's future 7 years ago. He hadn't just been a witness to her pain, he was the architect of it. The jade rings he wore weren't just jewelry. They were the spoils of a war he had waged against a man whose only sin was his skin. The balcony door slid open, and Jae-Won stepped back inside, a faint, hopeful smile touching his lips. Amara, it's over. The charges are being dropped. We won. She didn't look up. She simply held the ledger toward him, her hands as cold as ice. The physical proof of his sins lay open between them, the ink of his prejudice starring him in the face. When she finally looked at him, the mockery from the gala was gone, replaced by a grief so deep it was silent. Jae-Won's smile died instantly. He didn't need to ask what she had found. The ledger was the mirror he had been avoiding his entire life, and in it, he finally saw the monster she had known him to be all along. The silence in the penthouse was no longer a bridge. It was a canyon. Amara walked out that night without uttering another word, leaving the ledger open on the desk like an autopsy report of Jae-Won's soul. In the weeks that followed, the White Tiger did not pursue her with flowers or pleas for forgiveness. He understood now that some debts cannot be settled with jewelry or charm. They require the total dismantling of the world that created the debt in the first place. Jae-Won began a public execution of his own legacy. To the shock of the criminal underworld and the Seoul business elite, he called a press conference not to defend his empire, but to gut it. He announced the formation of the Sinclair Foundation, a multi-million-dollar venture capital fund dedicated exclusively to entrepreneurs from marginalized backgrounds, the very people his traditions had spent decades silencing. He didn't stop there. He purged his board of directors, removing the men who had whispered the same slurs his father had taught him, and opened his shipping routes to the very innovators he had once called outsiders. He was losing power, losing status, and losing the respect of the men who feared him. And for the first time, he felt like he was finally standing upright. Months later, he found Amara standing by her father's memorial in a quiet corner of the city. She wasn't wearing pink. She was dressed in a simple, professional suit, looking at the fresh flowers he had left there every morning for 90 days. When he approached, he didn't use his guards or his influence to corner her. He stopped 10 feet away, his head slightly bowed, his hands empty. I have spent my life believing that power was about who you could keep out, Jae-Won said, his voice cracking with a vulnerability that would have been unrecognizable a year ago. I was a small man in a large suit. I cannot bring your father back. I cannot erase the ink on that ledger. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers, not for a way in, but for a way to be better. I dismantled the Jae-Won tradition because it was a poison. I don't ask for your love, Amara. I don't even ask for your trust. I only ask for the chance to be near the person who showed me that my world was a lie. I want the chance to be the man you made me want to become." Amara looked at the memorial, then back at the man who had once seen her as an impossibility. She didn't smile, and she didn't reach for his hand. Redemption, she knew, was a journey of 1,000 miles, and he had only taken the first few steps. But as she adjusted the collar of her coat, she didn't walk away. "It's a long road, Han Yi-won," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of a hopeful, heavy future. "I know," he replied, standing his ground, "and I'm ready to walk it,